Okay, so this all ties together with what we talked about a little bit earlier, and that is excavation techniques. Right. So what I hope you'll see by the end of this is that context is crucial. Right? Excavation has to be careful, rigorous, with lots of documentation. Um, this is very, very important because otherwise you won't be able to interpret the finds or interpret the um, purpose of the site or the room or the area correctly, right? But if you properly excavate an area, you can associate finds with each other, right? That is, you can say, uh, you know, all of these materials were found on the floor of the house. They all date to the use of the house, or this, piece of wood is associated with these ceramics, so we can date the wood using radiocarbon dating and thereby help date the ceramics more tightly. Right? And you have to pay attention to primary, secondary, and tertiary context. So primary is the best context. Secondary is also useful, but tertiary is not really going to give you very much information. So I want to show you a little bit of an excavation I worked on in Turkey when I was a graduate student. I like to tell people archaeology is for young and old, but this was one of the local villagers at a site I worked at in Turkey, and he's posing in an empty tomb that we excavated. And here's a child of people who own the land that we were working on who's having a little fun, you can see there. So this site is a site called Tilbes Huyuk. Huyuk, again, in Turkish is the same thing as tell. You can see it's a tell here. These are the people's fruit garden, fruit groves. They lived in this house on top. It's right next to the Euphrates River, and the Turkish government was building a dam right about here. And so now actually the site is mostly underwater. So when we were working there, it was a salvage project, right? That is, we got permission to work there. You can see how close it is to the river. We got permission to work there to salvage any kind of information before it was flooded. All right, as we talked about earlier, you're essentially digging backwards in time from youngest to oldest, from most recent to furthest back in time. So as we started to dig, we got remains of walls. We carefully kept track of what was found in each of these contexts, right? So you separate things by layer. You separate things by maybe the structure that they're found in. You can see this is a later pit that ended up destroying the floor of this building, right? So this pit is from a later time period. Now, once we documented this and mapped it in and photographed it, then we removed all of these stones. That's one of the things that surprises many people, is that, especially in the tell site, if you want to get down to the earlier levels, you have to remove everything from the upper level. Now, if it's so unique and something that no one has ever found before, then maybe you will leave it in place or carefully remove it to some other place, let's say like a museum. But walls are found in tells all the time, so this was nothing extraordinary. So we removed it, and underneath we found the outline of a mud brick house with lots of evidence of burning, right? So dark ash filled the house. That was a very good sign to us because burning, as we said before, tends to preserve things. Burning will carbonize wood, and the wood will preserve. And we're going to talk about dating this week, and you can use wood for several different types of dating. Also, burning tends to destroy the house in an instant, and it's buried quickly, rather than being open and exposed to the elements for a long period of time. So you get more of a snapshot with a burned building than you do with, let's say, a slowly eroding building. So here are the local workers, and you can see they're slowly going down level by level. We try and pay attention to any change in the soil color or the texture, which will indicate to us that we're now in a different stratigraphic level. So you can see, well, now you can see the finished room. Everything that was found in place, we call that in situ, in place. Everything that was in place was recorded as being in place in primary context. Right? So we found roof beams, burnt roof beams in this lowest level here. You can see that's very, very dark. And below that were objects on the floor. For example, we found burnt seeds in the hearth. We found burnt goat horn cores as well in the room. And we found, I'm going to point out, these clay horns in these niches over here. So what you can see here is this is the initial abandonment of the room. So everything below this area dates to when the house was being used. Everything above, you can see, is much less ash, right? It's kind of light brownish. That dates to the period after the initial use and after the abandonment. That's kind of post-abandonment phase. So things that are found in here are not going to tell you as much about what the actual room was used for as much as here, right? And so this material is the material that is, in some ways, will tell you more crucial things about the room. And this is why it's important to carefully excavate, because if you just dug all the way down quickly to the bottom, then you would end up mixing up these two levels, and that would skew your results. Okay, so again, this is it from a different angle. We found clay horns in situ, in place in some of these things. Now, the joke in archaeology is that if you don't know what something is, it's ritual, it's religious. And that played out certainly with this structure, because we found two sets of clay horns here. When we found the first set, one of the excavators came by and said, oh, this was probably a religious structure, because these clay horns are obviously used for ritual. Second archaeologist came by and, looking at the same evidence, said, oh, this was just an ordinary house, and they probably used those clay horns to hold a pot. Later on, when I found the second pair of clay horns with the workers, the first archaeologist came by and said, oh, a second pair of horns, that proves it's ritual. And the second archaeologist came by later and said, oh, a second pair of horns, oh, that shows that the horns are not that special. So it's still, it confirms my original idea that it was just domestic. I analyzed the room for a report, and I believe that actually probably was ritual, because only this building is burned in this level, and it's really the only building from this level that's preserved. So there seems to be something special about that building, and it might have been intentionally burned. So then we removed all of this stuff. And there's the other joke in archaeology is that you're always going to make a find on the last day of the excavation, when you know you can't have tomorrow, and you end up scrambling to finish up that last day. So when we removed the burnt building, we went down, we found a series of pits. Pits tend to have softer soil than the material around them. So these pits have to be excavated first before this material, because this pit and this pit is younger than this material over here. So you can see part of the wall here. We excavated the pits, and when we reached the bottom of one of the pits, we found that the pit had cut into a tomb or burial that was over here, and it just cut the edge. Now, because the tomb was now exposed, we could not just leave the contents in there, because they might have been taken out or robbed. We couldn't excavate all the way down to the top of it, because this was the last day. So we documented and carefully salvaged the materials from the tomb, essentially from the side. And what we found was an early bronze tomb of a pretty well-off person, with all of these beautiful ceramic vessels. You can see they're probably used for drinking or feasting. These are the kinds of serving dishes you would expect, as well as some bronze objects as well. Okay, so it's almost like a dissection in anatomy class. You're dissecting the site layer by layer. You're trying to go from the oldest. You're trying to remove the youngest material first, and then go down to the oldest material. Now, this is a top-down view. Imagine if you're excavating in a trench and you see different colored soil, but you don't know which is older and which is younger. There's really two scenarios that could be at play here. right? That is, you're looking from the top here. That is, maybe this greenish brown material lies under the yellowish brown, or the yellowish brown lies under the greenish brown. In either case, from the top view, it's going to look the same. So how do you figure out which scenario is correct? What you would do is you would excavate here, and you would see, okay, if I scrape here, is there more green showing up, showing that the green is underneath this layer? Or when I scrape it, does the green start to disappear, showing that the yellow extends underneath it? Right. Okay, so all sorts of tools and all sorts of excavation techniques. If you are excavating a secondary context, let's say just kind of rubble and fill in a house, for example, not a pit. A pit you would kind of carefully excavate, because sometimes you'll actually have stratigraphy within the pit that's related to the pit. But let's say people just dumped a whole bunch of garbage into an abandoned house. You're not going to excavate that as carefully as you would primary context, things right on the floor. If you're excavating like a North American site or a prehistoric site, where there's not a lot of material before you get down to remains, you're going to carefully map in the location of all the objects that you find, right? And record things. So you're going to record what the soil looked like. You're going to say, all the pottery associated with this stratigraphic level have these numbers, right? So that way later, as you're studying the pottery, you know exactly where they came from. You're going to pay close attention to soil color changes, because that will help you figure out if you are digging into a pit or digging into a new stratigraphic level. You're going to carefully take out the remains of animals, artifacts, plant remains, and you're going to bag them and analyze them after the excavation. So with an excavation, there's analysis of material that goes on during the excavation, but most of that continues into the rest of the academic year. So you might excavate for a month and a half, and then you will spend 7 months analyzing the material that you excavated, right? And then of course is mapping everything in, cataloging it, making sure you have adequate documentation. You saw some of the burials that students excavated. This is that teenage girl that was excavated by a Grand Valley student, right? And you can see the remains here. This is primary context, and these are some of the things that were found, right? These clay beads that were part of a necklace and an earring. There were 2 earrings that were found. So when you're digging at human remains, and we're going to be looking at human remains later on in the class, you can describe burials in different ways. There's simple burials, extended burials where the body is laid out flat, flexed, where the legs are bent a little bit, less than 90 degrees, crouched. The knees are bent up to the chin, so that's almost like a fetal position. Supine on the back, prone, face down. And also you might describe if there's one individual or multiple people. There's also primary burials and secondary burials. Secondary burials, such as you can see here in this ossuary box. This is a pretty small limestone box where this is from the time period of Jesus. And what they would do during that time period is bury someone in the tomb. When the remains of the person had decomposed and there were only bones left, the bones would be collected and placed in the box, and the box would be put in a different part of the tomb. So that is a secondary burial, because that's not where that person initially was buried. You could have monumental tombs. This is the famous tomb in the Maya city of Palenque of King Pakal. You could have barrows, as they're called in Europe usually, or tumuli, or we just might call them burial mounds here in North America, right? Norton Mounds in Millennium Park are a sacred site to the Native American tribes in the area, and date back to I believe, the Mississippian period, so something like 1200 AD. Rock shelters, caves, right, are a different kind of burial as well. So here in the Maya region, limestone that dissolves from the cave walls helps preserve the skeletons. Okay, what we're going to be talking about next is dating techniques. You're going to get to experiment with some dating techniques. I have some try it problems for you, so you'll get to learn about these firsthand, and learn about dating techniques that I'm sure you've heard about, like radiocarbon dating, and then other techniques that might be less well known to you.